Hey everyone, happy Thursday. This week we are painting still life objects that are symmetrical and coming from the kitchen. And today's still life is an Agnes designed and inspired still life. So Agnes likes to take her little bowls from the kitchen and little toys that she has lying around, and she'll pour water into the bowl and then put a toy in the bowl. And so this was just sitting on the kitchen table this morning. And so I grabbed it and was like, this is a fun color palette. It's a little purpley pink bowl with a yellow ducky in it with water sitting in it. So I'm like, I'm just going to take this up to the studio and paint this today. So that's what I ended up doing for today's painting. So let's get to it. Let's paint. Okay, so it is day number 14, and we are at it again, and we are painting today a still life that my oldest daughter, Agnes, actually put together. I was down in the kitchen, and I saw this little floating duck in some water in this bowl, and Agnes does this all the time. She just like grabs a bowl, and she'll put water in it, she'll put her toys in it, and she tells these little stories about what's happening with these things. So I just saw this downstairs and I was like, you know what? I'm going to paint this today. This looks fun. And it's something that I didn't really determine. It's something that my daughter put together and something I would probably never think to put together and then paint. But that's one of those benefits of having a 3-year-old around, and they just put these weird things together and they're really fun and creative and have these little narratives to them. And she probably would have had a name for this duck and a whole storyline behind why the duck got into this bowl. And maybe it wasn't even a bowl. More than likely, it wasn't a bowl in my daughter's mind. It was some kind of ocean or something, and this duck is going on an adventure. So that's what I decided to paint today. So I thought I would talk a little bit about materials, because some people have been sending me messages about materials and what kind of materials I like to use and whatnot. To be honest, I'm not insanely specific about the materials that I use, especially when it comes to paint. What's most important to me with paint is that you can actually mix the colors that you're setting out to mix with the paint, and that the viscosity of the paint is usable. So the only kind of paints that I would really avoid are like student grade cadmiums, because they're really just like hardly any cadmium in the paint, and then they're just jam-packed full of a lot of filler. So when you try to mix with a student grade paint, it's just going to turn to mud instantly. The paint looks really nice just out of the tube, so if you're a painter who's just using paint straight out of the tube, might as well just use student grade paint, because you're not mixing with it and it has a similar color and look right out of the tube. So in that case, it's totally worth just saving some money and getting student grade paint. But if you're a painter who's mixing with those paints and combining them to make secondary colors, then that's when you really want to have a paint that has a high pigment load. So typically, almost any artist grade paint that you pick up is going to have a higher pigment load, at least high enough of a pigment load that you can mix with it. So I'm not the type of painter that's going to be super particular about the brand that you get, like, oh my gosh, you only have to use like Michael Harding or Old Holland or Natural Pigments or something. These companies that are definitely amazing paint, and you can do things with those paints that you can't do with other paints. But if you're just wanting to mix colors accurately and lay the paint on in a pretty standard way, to where you're not trying to accomplish any specific kind of surface effect with the paint, like some kind of really ropey or stringy effect, like with a lead white paint or with like an ultramarine that doesn't have wax in it or something, then I would say artist grade paint from basically any paint manufacturer is going to work just fine for like 95% of painters. But for those other 5% of painters that are like super into technical surface effects with paint, then they might want to actually exploit the unique physical characteristics of specialty paint or boutique paint manufacturers. But for me, honestly, I don't really do any kind of special effects. I am more of just somebody who's interested in mixing color accurately. That's where most of my attention is bent when I'm painting. So if I'm going to really take my time with something in a painting, typically it's going to be the accuracy of the value and the accuracy of the hue and saturation of any color that I'm mixing. Another thing about materials that I really love to do is buy paint in bulk. So I have like a ton of paint available for me. And one reason that is that it helps me to not be stingy with paint. This is something that's always really hard for students when they first start painting, is that they never want to put enough paint out on their palette. They put like a little pea-sized dollop of paint on their palette, and they do that for every color. And then, 30 seconds into the painting, they've already used it. So then they grab the tube of paint again and put another little dollop on the palette. I totally get it. It's because the paint is expensive and they feel like, oh shoot, I don't want to use too much of this because they know how much it costs. To get around that, sometimes I just encourage students to like buy paint in bulk if they can. And I know this is a challenge when you're young, but one thing that I've told students to do, and I think is a great thing to do, is to find a company that sells paint in quarts or pints and then split it with another student. So there's this great paint making company in New York called RGH, and they sell paint in cans. They'll even send you a gallon of paint if you order it. And the cost of the paint when it's in a can like this is just so much cheaper than it is when it's tubed up in a tube for you. Even when you buy like a studio tube, it's still quite a bit more expensive than if you buy it in a can. Almost double the price, honestly. So that's one thing that I'll do. I'll just buy a bunch of paint in bulk, like quarts of paint, and then I'll tube it up into a bunch of studio tubes myself. And it's super easy to tube paint. It seems like a scary thing to do, but it's actually like one of the easiest things to do. And then I have 6 studio tubes of like a cadmium red sitting there waiting for me. So I never feel like I'm going to run out of paint, and I'm never hesitant to put more than enough paint on my palette. So that kind of frees me up to just really use the right amount of paint that I need to use. So if anything, usually I'm actually mixing up more paint than I need. So I would say that's probably a better habit to be in than mixing too little paint. Because when you mix too little paint, you always end up having to remix the same color over and over. And then the painting process just slows down so much. And by the time you've mixed up like 5 colors, you are so exhausted and you can't maintain that kind of level of focus and level of attention as you're working as you would if you had just put the proper amount of paint out on your palette. There was something that I remember reading as a student that really hit home for me, and it was, I think, some students of John Singer Sargent talking about how he would lay out his palette when he painted. And they said that the one thing that Sargent would always do with all of his students, anytime he came over to them, is if they didn't have enough paint on their palette, he would grab their tubes of paint and squeeze enough paint out on the palette for almost 3 paintings. So that kind of hit home with me. And I was like, you know what? When you get in the zone of painting, the last thing you want to think about is having to stop and grab a tube of paint or search through the box or whatever that you have your paint sitting in and find the right color of paint and then uncap it, put some paint out on the palette, then recap it. It doesn't seem like it takes that long, but it probably takes you sometimes nearly 2 minutes to do that. And then you lose your train of thought. You forget what you were doing. You forget what color you were mixing, and it just slows you down. So that's something that I've always tried to do myself, and I always try to get my students to do this. And again, it's hard to do when paint just feels expensive, but it's so worth it. So that's one piece of advice that I would always give students. and that I usually encourage anyone is to put more than enough paint out on your palette. Buy paint in bulk so it doesn't feel so precious and you're able to actually use it rather than just kind of be scared of it. So before I get too far into the painting, let's talk about the painting a little bit. You'll notice again today that I went back into that perspective drawing trick. I really took my time mapping out the perspective of the bull, using the diagonal X trick through the top of the bull to map out where the ellipse is going to sit, and then work all of that out really carefully. I took my time measuring a lot in this painting, probably almost too much if I'm going to be honest, and then I finally started mixing the colors and going at it. And in the setup for today's painting, there's this pretty saturated purple foam or purpley violet colored foam that the bowl is sitting on top of. And so I had to pull out my dioxazine purple to hit these colors because they're just so saturated. I would have never been able to mix those dark purples with a blue and a red mixed together. It just would have never hit that saturation. And for me, since I am mixing these colors side by side and trying to match them within a certain level of accuracy, I end up using a lot of really saturated colors. And this wasn't the case when I was a younger painter, and I would sort of mix colors a little bit more relatively rather than literally what was in front of me. It was only really when I started using my knife and holding my knife in front of the setup and really trying to match the colors perfectly until I couldn't decipher where the paint started and where the color I was trying to match began on the knife as I held the palette knife up in front of what I was looking at. It wasn't until I started doing that that I realized how desaturated a lot of the colors were that I was mixing, to where I thought they were actually the proper saturation, but really they were not at all saturated enough. So it was probably maybe 6 years ago or so that I started really expanding my palette and started using a lot of phthalos, a lot of quinacridons, Hansa yellow, dioxazine purple. I just started using a lot of really high key colors that were never on my palette as a student. As a student, I pretty much only used ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, occasionally a cerulean blue, and the brightest green I ever used was a Viridian. And now I've been really loving using like a phthalo emerald or a phthalo green. I use those pretty frequently when I'm mixing from life now. I always thought that cadmiums were more than enough saturated, but I started realizing how cadmiums really couldn't hit a lot of the color notes that I was trying to hit, especially in the last like 2 or 3 years. These paintings that I've been doing that are a lot higher key, and I'm painting these setups that have materials in them that are like brightly colored construction paper or this kind of foam material that has a really saturated dye in the material of the paper or in the material of the foam. And I was only able to hit most of those colors with using like phthalos and quinacridons straight out of the tube. And sometimes if I had to lighten those colors up and I added a little bit of like a titanium white or a little bit of a lead white if it was a warmer color to try to hit the saturation, I would end up having to glaze over top of that super high key color with another really saturated color in a glaze to really hit the color properly. So anyways, I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole, but all that to say that oil paint actually has a pretty limited gamut of color, and if you're matching colors directly with what's in front of you, you almost always have to be painting with a really high-key palette, a really saturated palette. And I never thought I would have to do that. When I was a student, I was totally convinced that I could mix any color with the paints that I had on my palette. And it wasn't until I started really experimenting with the way I was setting up my paintings with light, and when I started really trying to match colors precisely, that I realized how dull oil paint can actually be. These colors that we think of as really saturated colors like cadmiums, they're really not that colorful. They're really not that saturated, especially when you start comparing them to materials that are manufactured with using these fugitive dyes and whatnot. So this painting was actually pretty challenging. The drawing in it was so specific. I had all of these multiple ellipse shapes that were happening together in the object of the bull. You'll notice too, when I was painting the yellow duck, I had to do so many passes of attempts at that gradient, that sort of sphere-like gradient pattern that goes around on the head of the duck, that I finally realized that I needed to put a lot more wrap the highlights a little bit more around that sphere. And that helped me hit the form of that head of the duck. But I was like, man, when am I going to get this? And I was just keying the whole head of the duck a little bit too dark. And that's what was messing with my perception of it as I was painting. So that was today's painting. It was fun to talk about materials a little bit. Maybe tomorrow I'll continue that, talk a little bit more about some other things with materials. If you have any questions about materials too, feel free to send me a message and I'll try to get back to you. And maybe I'll be able to actually talk about that in one of the videos. We've got one more of these still life paintings to go this week of symmetrical objects from the kitchen. So I'll see you all tomorrow. I hope you have a great day. Take it easy. Bye.